our lab for today. So the urinary and reproductive systems. And we want to start with the kidneys first. We're going to start with the urinary system, which is comprised of the kidneys and the collecting structures such as the ureters and bladder. So the kidneys, we're going to start off, are paired organs. They are retroperitoneal. And this simply means that they are behind the gastrointestinal viscera. So they are separated from other organs like the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, parts of the gastrointestinal tract by that peritoneal membrane. So they're behind that membrane and very, very close to the posterior abdominal wall where we have muscles and then some of that extra peritoneal fat. When you think about the kidneys' function overall, they're going to be important for filtering blood, therefore producing urine. They're also going to be involved in other secondary functions, such as erythropoietin, which is really important for blood cell production, as well as offering the pH of our blood. So they have several other functions involved with hormone release, etc., but their main role is production of urine. Now, the left kidney is going to be slightly higher than the right. And this is because of the liver on the right side. So left kidney is about at the level of the upper pole, is about the level of the 11th rib. Right kidney upper pole is at the level of about the 12th rib, so slightly lower. And so they're going to be protected by those floating ribs, right? Posteriorly, let's say you had a fracture of your 11th or 12th rib, you really want to make sure that the kidney is not injured in that. When you think about the hilum of the kidney, it's going to be facing the middle or medial part where we have the vessels, such as the IVC and the aorta. So this region is called the hilum. This is also where we have that indentation where the arteries, the veins, and then the ureter, you see the ureter back here, are entering or leaving the center of the kidney. So the hilum is a really important region where all of this blood supply and ureter can actually enter the kidney. I do also want to point out the adrenals. It's really difficult to talk about the kidneys without talking about the adrenal glands. They're also paired and they're sitting on the top of both kidneys. When you think about the adrenal, they're separate in function. The adrenals are involved in the hormone production, but they're very closely adhered and almost inseparable from the kidney itself, but different in function. Oh, I think I jumped the gun here. So the suprarenal or adrenal glands, they're above the kidneys. They are separated internally. They have two separate features. The cortex is the lighter staining outer region of the kidney. This is involved in hormone production, such as cortisol, etc., and other steroids. The inner region, darker staining, this is the medulla. Different tissue entirely is going to be involved in epinephrine and norepinephrine production. So more involved in the autonomic nervous system, particularly the sympathetic part of that, where hormones, again, can be released. So those are your adrenal glands, again, paired bilaterally, and then similarly, left slightly higher than the right. Let's look at the internal aspect of the kidneys. So the kidneys are also divided into a cortex and medulla, just like the adrenals are. The cortex is the outer, similarly pale staining region of the kidney, whereas the medulla, or what we call the pyramids, are actually the central regions that are shaped in these sort of pyramidal-like structures. So the pyramids are going to be formed by the loops of Henle. And this is why we call these medullary or pyramidal rays, because they have these lines which are representative of the loops of Henle. And when you get to the urinary system in your lecture part of the course, you'll talk all about how urine is produced and condensed, particularly with the help of the nephrons and the loop of Henle. We also want to think about the renal columns. The renal columns are these patches of cortex that are in between the renal pyramids. And these are also going to be comprised of the nephron, particularly the glomerulus, which are going to be making up most of the cortex itself. Okay. Now, in terms of urine collection, we want to think about urine as being made as a filtrate of blood. So our blood is filtered through the glomerulus. We're talking about the microstructure of the kidney now. The glomerulus, which is in the outer parts of the kidney, blood vessels, which are these tiny branches, are going to send blood into the glomerulus, filter that across the Bowman's capsule, and then begin to collect that into the nephron itself. Connect that into the collecting parts of the nephron. So the proximal tubes, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubules. So that process of collecting that filtrate and then fine-tuning it by either reabsorbing some things or filtering them out by way of secretion, that is how we produce the ultimate filtrate, which is called urine. So we then go from the minor calyx, which are these smaller collecting branches, so that urine filtrate is produced at these tips called the renal papilla. And then they are transferred to the minor calyx, these smaller collecting structures. That eventually leads to the major calyx, which are the larger parts that ultimately lead to the renal pelvis, which is the narrowing that forms the ureter, and then eventually into the ureter, and then down toward the bladder. So that is the collection pathway. Minor calyx to major calyx to renal pelvis, and then eventually ureter, and then bladder. And that is how we get our filtrate that's made from the nephron, eventually being stored in the bladder. Let's make our way down into the pelvis and talk about the bladder. Now, the bladder is basically a storage tank, right? Like the word bladder would infer, kind of like the gallbladder is for bile. The bladder is basically holding urine until it is ready to be released through the ureteral orifices. So ureters are going to go from the hilum down into these orifices, these openings. And then this is how the bladder can fill. Now, the bladder is made of this stretchy epithelia, so it has this ability to stretch to accommodate very large amounts of urine. At the inferior aspect, we're going to have the internal urethral orifice. Now we're going to go from ureter to urethra. So there are two ureteral openings and one urethral opening that leads to the urethra. And this is how urine can exit the bladder and make its way out onto the external body surface. Okay. Now, as you would imagine, there are sphincters, which are made of smooth muscle that actually control the opening and the release of urine from the bladder. Some are voluntarily controlled by us. This is how we can make the decision to void, and then others are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. We also want to think about this region where the openings leave, right? So the one opening leaves and then two openings enter. This triangular region that's created by these three openings is called the trigone. So the trigone is collectively the region, that smooth region at the back of the bladder that is connecting these three openings. Okay. We can also talk about the fundus of the bladder, which is similar to the trigone here, kind of that central, smooth, more rounded area. And then look at how the bladder has this dome shape, and it can stretch very large. It can actually go way up into the abdominal cavity and to the suprapubic region when the bladder is full. Let's move on to look at the urethra. So we've talked about ureters, which collect urine from the kidney to the bladder. Now we have urethra, which is a singular structure going from the bladder to the external surface. And as you would imagine, the anatomy differs greatly by males and females. Okay, so the male urethra is going to be much longer. It's going to have three different parts because it has to travel through the prostate, the floor of the pelvis, right? This is called the membranous part of the urethra, and then eventually the penis itself, the spongiosum. So those three parts make for a much longer urethra in males. In females, the urethra is much shorter. It's about 4 centimeters. It goes from the base of the bladder through the external orifice and much, much shorter in length. For that reason, it's much more common to see things like UTIs in females because it's a shorter distance from the outer surface right into the urethra and then eventually into the bladder. So we can see lots of ascending infections, much more common in females than we do in males, all right? We also want to think about the opening from the bladder to the urethra being the internal urethral orifice, whereas the opening from the urethra to the outside environment is going to be the external urethral orifice. So I talked about how we have these two openings. They're kind of sphincters that are made, secured by smooth muscle. The external orifice we do have control of. So when you make a decision to void, you have voluntary control over the muscle of the external orifice. And the internal orifice is going to be controlled by the parasympathetic system, which will make decisions about based upon how full the bladder is and other factors. Let's look at the inguinal region here. The inguinal region is the region between the pubis and the lower sort of abdominal region, kind of that umbilical or inguinal region. And there are several important structures here where we have the inguinal ligament. So this is really the entryway from the abdomen to the lower extremity, as well as into the pelvis. So the inguinal ligament is running from the anterior superior iliac spine. This is one of the bony landmarks of the ilium, of the pubic bone, of the ilium bone. And then the attachment of that is going to be the pubis. So the pubic symphysis of the pubic bone. And this helps to separate, again, abdominal contents or abdominal cavity from the lower extremity. And we're going to have several vessels that actually pass under the inguinal ligament and are going to make their way, such as the femoral artery, into the thigh. Let's think about the components of the inguinal region here. And this becomes especially important in males when we think about things like inguinal hernias, etc., and the inguinal canal. Now, the inguinal canal has two openings, and this is the passageway for the development of the testes. So we have the deep inguinal ring, and then we have a superficial inguinal ring. So this creates this passageway. Now, we can see things like the intestinal contents herniate through this passageway, and that is what creates a hernia. So because we have this space that was created by way of the descent of the testes. So remember, in males, the testes actually develop in the abdominal wall. They develop very close to where we find the kidneys now, and then they take this path of descent so that by the first year of life, a male infant will have their testes residing in the scrotal sac, which is down outside of the pelvic cavity. But we want to remember that they initially developed and resided in the abdomen. So on their descent, they kind of get dragged and create this passageway. And so this becomes a space that can be occupied by the intestinal contents to create hernias later on, which is also why hernias are much more common in males than they are in females, all right, especially inguinal hernias. So those two openings, the deep ring and then the superficial ring, are what create the inguinal canal and then, are what transfer down into the scrotal sac. Let's look at the female reproductive system. So we're going to kind of make our way from the urogenital system and look at the reproductive structures. We want to start with the females and think about the gametes here. So the ova, which are the egg cells, are what help to facilitate conception. These are the female gametes, and these are being made and matured in the ovaries. The ovaries are analogous to the testes in males. So the female gametes mature in the ovaries, the male gametes would mature in the testes, and they're both paired bilateral organs respectively. Now the females are going to have the duct system that basically guides the ova and sperm once they're fertilized towards the uterus. This is called the uterine tube. So here are the ovaries where the ova are being matured and developed. Every month during ovulation, one of those is going to rupture off. It's going to be swept up by the fimbriae of the uterine tube, and then it's going to be transferred by the sweeping motion of the cilia that are found internally all the way to through the uterine tube. Now, if there is a mature, viable sperm in the uterine tube at this point, then we're going to see fertilization. And then from there, we're going to begin to see the zygote formation, which is a fertilized egg, and that is going to lead to the embryogenesis. Now, that is eventually going to make its way down the oviduct or the uterine tube, all the way to the uterus where implantation will occur. So very important to think about that duct that guides the ova and sperm, ensuring their union, right? Providing all the right temperatures, all the right factors, all the right nutrition